Casper College. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Darren Devine. I'm honored to be the president of Casper College. So this evening we bring to you Alex Epstein. Alex is a philosopher and energy expert who argues that human flourishing should be the guiding principle of energy and environmental progress. He's the author of the new best-selling book, Fossil Future: Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal, and Natural Gas, Not Less. He's also the creator of EnergyTalkingPoints.com, a source of powerful, well-referenced talking points on energy, the environment, and general climate issues. Alex is widely recognized as a master of persuasion and debate on many issues, including energy. He's spoken at dozens of Fortune 500 companies, as well as prominent universities, including Harvard, Yale, Stanford, Duke, his alma mater, and of course, most importantly now, Casper College. He's also a highly sought after consultant on messaging, working with dozens of major political offices on pro-energy and pro-freedom messaging. Before we bring Alex up, I have one more announcement for you. Thanks to the amazing generosity of True Companies, there is a book signing afterwards. You do not have to pay for the book. That has already been taken care of, again with the generosity of the True Companies, at least until we run out. But it looks like we ought to be awfully darn close to get everyone this evening. So if you'll bring, help me welcome Alex Epstein to the podium.
Thanks. All right. So I have a sense that this audience is a little different than most college audiences I speak to, but let me just take a quick poll to confirm that. So when I say the words fossil fuels, I'm going to give you three options, okay? So you either feel strongly positive, kind of non-committal, or strongly negative. You have to pick one of the three. So you can say in the middle. I'm getting some echo first. Are you guys hearing an echo? So I'm not sure if we're using two mics or something like that, but we'll persist. So if you feel strongly positive when I say fossil fuels, raise your hand. All right, so I already know the situation. Okay, so this is now my normal experience at schools, right? At most schools, the idea is that we should be rapidly eliminating fossil fuels. And so what I'm saying is very controversial. So, because I'm saying the title of my book is Fossil Futures. That means we should have a future with fossil fuels, and not only some fossil fuels, but the argument is why global human flourishing requires more fossil fuels, more oil, coal, and natural gas, not less. And so since you guys are generally on board, what I want to focus tonight on is what is the real argument for this? What is a really powerful argument for this? Because from my perspective, unfortunately, most of the world does not have your enthusiasm for fossil fuels, quite the opposite. And I would like to change that, and I would like your help in changing that, and I think I can give you some really good ways of thinking about the issue and talking about the issue that can make you more effective than you might have thought possible. So that's going to be my goal today, so not just to make you a supporter of fossil fuels, and more broadly what I call energy freedom, but to become what I would call a champion, so somebody who's effective at persuading other people. And to start off in terms of where to start, I think it's important to recognize why people are against fossil fuels, or at least why to some people it makes sense to them that they're against fossil fuels. So we have an interesting situation in the world today. And the situation is, so most of our energy comes from fossil fuels, oil, coal, and natural gas. And so that's where we get, we'll see 80% of our energy from. And like many products, when you use fossil fuels, it has certain side effects. And the side effect that is most concerning to people, I'm not saying it should be, but is most concerning to people is when you put more CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it has some kind of warming effect. I'm stressing some kind. That doesn't at all mean a catastrophic effect, doesn't even mean negative, but I do believe, and I think most scientists rightly believe, that it has some impact. And so this is an interesting thing. You've got a benefit and you've got a side effect, and there's a question of what do you do about it? What should be our policy toward fossil fuels and their CO2 emissions? So should it be that we have total freedom to use fossil fuels? Should we rapidly eliminate fossil fuels? Should it be somewhere in between? And interestingly, The popular answer is we should rapidly eliminate fossil fuels, so net zero by 2050. So what net zero by 2050 means is that by the year 2050, we're not adding any new CO2 or other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and in practice, that means little to no fossil fuel use. Some people think that you can just use the same amount of fossil fuels or more, and you're going to be able to cheaply capture the CO2. I think there's no evidence that you're going to be able to do that on a global scale. So net zero means rapidly eliminate fossil fuels. And this is really, I want to stress, this is a real challenge if you like fossil fuels, because this is literally the most popular political idea in the world today. So if you think about what does almost every government agree to, what does almost every leading corporation endorse, what does almost every leading financial institution endorse, it's hard to find anything that they all agree on, but they all agree on net zero, which means they all agree on let's rapidly eliminate fossil fuels. Now, there's an opening, though. And the opening is that these net zero policies have been leading to problems. It's pretty clear, they're trying to deny it, but it's pretty clear they're leading to problems. And they're leading to problems that the advocates of net zero never told us about, and they're leading to problems even when we're only going a tiny fraction of the way toward net zero. So net zero means essentially get rid of fossil fuels. You'll see we haven't even reduced fossil fuels yet. We've slowed the growth. We haven't even reduced it, and yet slowing the growth of fossil fuels has led to some huge problems. So for example, I live in California, and we have problems that are starting to spread around the country, which is we now have frequent electricity shortages, including major blackouts. And this very non-coincidentally happened after we shut down a bunch of natural gas plants. Suddenly we don't have enough power. Now we were promised that solar and wind would make up the difference, but it didn't seem to work. And it's happening around the country where you're having emergency alerts everywhere. Hey, we don't have enough power, we don't have enough power. It's like their whole job is to give you enough power, and nobody seems to be able to do their job, and it really seems related to they're trying not to use fossil fuels. Now, another thing we're seeing is dependence on other nations, and particularly hostile nations. We saw this most conspicuously with Europe begging everyone for fossil fuels once they realized how dependent they were on Russia when Russia invaded Ukraine. But it's not just Europe. We're seeing Joe Biden beg to Venezuela, to Saudi Arabia, and all of these people who are now begging were people who said, no, we're going to go net zero. We don't really need fossil fuels. They've said we're too slow to reduce fossil fuels, and yet now they need fossil fuels. A final one that is not talked about almost at all, but is very important, is that we have poor nations around the world having deadly shortages of fossil fuels, because what's happened is we've had shortages of fossil fuels. The wealthier nations, particularly European nations, are buying them, and that means there's not enough, or they're not affordable to places like Bangladesh. So you see power outages in Bangladesh because they can no longer afford natural gas. So people are starting to see this net zero thing isn't as clean as it's supposedly, because it's supposed to be just smooth and we're going to get rich and it's all going to be great and we'll all live on sunshine and rainbows and wind and this kind of thing. And it's not going very well. So I think that there's an opening, people seeing that there's something wrong. But I think to really take advantage of this situation, we need to be able to answer two questions. One is, what's wrong with the thinking behind net zero? There's something wrong with it, but what's wrong with it? Why is it that all these smart people have made all these mistakes, and there are all these negative consequences they didn't warn us of? So one is, what's going wrong with net zero? And then two, and this is very important as well, is what's a rational alternative? I think whenever you're criticizing a policy, there's a question of what's the rational alternative. And tonight I'm going to argue for an alternative called energy freedom, which is not just being pro-fossil fuels, it's being for the freedom of all forms of energy to compete and to be used with reasonable laws protecting people against pollution. So what's going wrong with net zero, and then what's the alternative? And this is where I think my background is useful. Now, I have an interesting energy background and energy story, because I am probably world's biggest advocate of fossil fuels. I'm wearing my I Love Fossil Fuels pin here. By the way, we have like 25 of them if you want to get them after and rush to get them. They're pretty cool. So I'm a big advocate of fossil fuels, but contrary to what people think, I had no connection at all to the fossil fuel industry when I came up with my views. I didn't even know anyone in the industry. And I didn't grow up in a pro-fossil fuel place. I grew up in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is the DC area, which is very anti-fossil fuels. I don't have any family involvement in fossil fuels. The Epstein family is not involved in fossil fuels. And by the way, I'm not related to Jeffrey Epstein, in case anyone is wondering. But there is something about my background that I think led me to this view, which is the background people think is useless, which is philosophy. So when I was 20, I was a computer science student at Duke University. I told my advisor, I'm never programming again. I want to become a philosopher. And he was very unimpressed with this, as you would probably be if your child or advisee said this. And his point was, well, why would you become a philosopher? Nobody ever has a problem and says, let's call a philosopher for a solution, right? It's seemingly a useless profession. But I actually picked it because I'm a very practical person, and I think it's the most practical profession. And one reason is because philosophy studies thinking methods. Most people don't think about thinking. They just think the way that they think. Philosophy teaches you to think about your thinking. When you're examining an issue, before you say, what do I think about fossil fuels? What do I think about climate change? First says, what's the right way to think about the problem? And when you think about the right way to think about fossil fuels, it becomes really clear what's wrong with net zero. So what's the right way to think about fossil fuels? Well, I think it's actually very simple, but most people don't do it, and no advocates of net zero do it. So thinking about fossil fuels is, I think, the same as thinking about any other product or technology, and there's one basic idea, which is that you carefully weigh the benefits and side effects of the alternatives. So, and interestingly, no one has ever disagreed with me on this. So if anyone disagrees, raise your hand and we'll have a good talk. And by the way, feel free to take pictures of the slides, but a more efficient thing, if you want, is just, and I think we're recording this or maybe streaming this, so anyone watching as well, you can just send me an email, alex@alexepstein.com, subject Wyoming, and then I'll send you a whole bunch of resources for free, including my deck. You can also go to the website, energytalkingpoints.com, and sign up there. You just won't get the deck if you go there. But anyway, more than welcome to take pictures. Just wanted to let you know. Okay, back to the thinking method. So we just need to carefully weigh the benefits and side effects of the alternative. So if I'm considering a prescription drug, I look at the benefits, I look at the side effects, I compare that to the alternatives, and I make a decision. Does anyone disagree with this? So here's the interesting thing. When it comes to fossil fuels and their side effects on climate, almost nobody follows this at all. And in particular, what the net zero movement does is it ignores the benefits of fossil fuels and it exaggerates the negative side effects. That's the key thing that's going wrong. It's ignoring the benefits and it's exaggerating the negative side effects. And let me break that down. So if we're talking about carefully weighing the benefits and side effects of fossil fuels, there are three things we need to factor in. And interestingly, nobody, even net zero advocates, nobody has ever disagreed with me on this. They just kind of pretend this doesn't exist because they don't have an answer to it. So number one is we need to factor in the broad benefits of fossil fuels. And when I say benefits of fossil fuels, I mean fossil fuels going forward. I don't just mean fossil fuels were good in the past. I mean going forward, what are the benefits of fossil fuels? And specifically, what are the benefits that we'll get from fossil fuels that we can't get if we get rid of fossil fuels? And one thing that I learned about early on, this was 16 years ago now, studying this issue, is that fossil fuels are uniquely beneficial in a very important realm. A very important realm, which is food. And I was supposedly very well educated. I went to Duke. I went to one of the top 10 math science high schools in the country, and yet I never learned this. I'm sure you guys all learned this, but I didn't learn this, which is part of why I wasn't pro-fossil fuels back then. And it's that fossil fuels are crucial to the availability of food for 8 billion people in two ways. So anyone want to suggest what are the ways in which fossil fuels are crucial to food? Fertilizer. So that's one. So modern fertilizer is derived from natural gas. We cannot feed 8 billion people without plentiful fertilizer. Before natural gas, we were trying to use bat guano. That was our best fertilizer. Bat guano didn't scale very well to 8 billion people. Natural gas is crucial. There's nothing close to natural gas in terms of fertilizer. Okay, what else? Okay, we got a bunch of them. We have transportation. I think people said farming, so I would call it mechanization or machine-based agriculture. So, you take the reaping and threshing of wheat, which is very crucial to a lot of people's diets. So a modern combine harvester allows one person to do the work that it used to take 1,000 good manual laborers to do. So it can amplify our ability by a factor of 1,000. So this is how we're able to feed 8 billion people. And those machines are powered overwhelmingly by diesel, which is uniquely good for powering that kind of equipment, in part because it's very dense fuel. Now, interestingly, the net zero advocates don't talk about this. An example I bring up in Fossil Future, I'm really excited that you guys get free copies and I can sign them, but an example I bring up is a guy named Michael Mann, who's one of the leading net zero advocates in the world. He's quoted all the time as this is one of the great experts, but if you look at his work, including he has a book, and I went through his whole book, and I looked for how many times does he mention any of the food benefits of fossil fuels? Because he talks about food a lot, but interestingly, he only talks about negatives of fossil fuels on food. And he does not once talk about the positives. He doesn't mention fertilizer, and he doesn't mention diesel fuel for mechanized agriculture. Now think about this. You cannot make a good decision about fossil fuels if you don't realize that they're crucial to the future of food. And yet this is what the alleged smartest people in the world are doing. So it's catastrophic to ignore the benefits of something, and yet that is very commonplace. Now the second error, the second thing that is obvious that we need to do, or it's clear we need to do that's not done, is factoring in a specific type of benefit, which I call climate mastery benefit of fossil fuels. So people talk about negatives of fossil fuels on climate, but if we talk about negatives, we have to talk about positives. And one of the number one benefits we get from fossil fuels is the ability to protect ourselves from virtually any type of climate danger. That's one of the things we do with fossil fuels, which I've been appreciating a lot as a Southern Californian being here. Every time I go outside, I just think like, nature wants to kill me, and I'm 45 minutes away from dying if I lost my jacket. So we do heating and cooling. We do, we build sturdy infrastructure. We have storm warning systems. We have evacuation systems. And maybe most importantly, we have ways of dealing with drought. Drought is historically the number one climate-related killer. So drought in past generations, not too long ago, could kill millions of people a year. And now, the rate of death from drought, very well documented, is less than 1 in 100 of what it was a century ago. And a huge part of that is using fossil fuels to power irrigation systems and using fossil fuels for transportation so that you can transport crops from areas that have a good harvest to areas that are stricken by drought. And yet what's interesting is the experts on this, or the so-called experts, don't talk about these climate mastery benefits, and they don't talk about the ways in which we're safer than ever from climate. And a perfect example is COP28. Has anyone heard of this thing, COP28, going on? So COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It's part of what's called the United Nations Framework Concerning Climate Change. And there's also another organization related. They have all these acronyms called IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the fascinating thing about these guys is that they're supposedly the climate expert place that's going to tell us all the facts about climate and is going to give us all the guidance about climate. And yet they are climate mastery deniers. You can read through thousands of pages of reports and they don't talk about our ability to master climate. So think about this. Imagine you had a report, an organization studying polio, right? And they didn't mention that there's a polio vaccine, and they didn't mention we have modern sanitation, and they didn't mention that we've eradicated polio from almost all the world. Like, you would consider that a bad organization studying polio. But the organization studying climate that doesn't mention all the benefits of fossil fuels to climate and doesn't mention that we're safer from climate than ever, which I'll show you in a lot of detail, they're considered a reputable organization. So again, they're making this basic mistake. This is very important for our thinking, but it's also very important and effective for our persuasion. Because here's the thing, not even most, all people will agree that we should carefully weigh the benefits and side effects. And so if you realize that people believe this, but they're not doing it, that it's common sense but not common practice, you have a very powerful weapon, which is you can just bring it up in conversation or whenever you persuade. And this is what I always do. Before I even argue with people, just say, well, would you agree we need to carefully weigh the benefits and side effects of fossil fuels? We can't just look at the negatives of fossil fuels and the positives of solar. That doesn't make any sense. And everyone will agree, and that gets them to think about it much more reasonably. But the way we're taught to think about it, automatically, if we don't think about our thinking, is unreasonable. So it's very, very powerful for persuasion to recognize this principle, this method of thinking. Now, the final thing is when we're looking at the side effects of burning fossil fuels on climate. So we definitely need to look at them, but we need to do two things. We need to be even-handed and precise. So even-handed means looking at not just negative, but positive. How often, here's a survey, how often do you see in the newspaper, maybe it happens in Wyoming, I've never seen it in California, where there's a really nice day and people say, thank you, climate change, for causing a really nice day? Or like we could have had, so it's interesting, like climate change, the impact of fossil fuels, it's only bad. But that should be very suspicious. How is it possible that if we're impacting the climate, it's all bad? Even if they ran stories 15% of the time saying, hey, thanks climate change for saving us from this storm, thanks for preventing us from dying from cold, then I would treat it credibly. But it's always negative. It's not positive, and yet there are some obvious benefits of more CO2 and more warming. More CO2 means more plant growth, all things being equal, and more warming benefits a lot of parts of the world. It turns out far more people die in the world from cold than from heat, and yet it's not discussed. So this is another error of only looking at the negatives. And then finally, we need to be precise. So whether we're talking about positives or negatives, we cannot exaggerate. And yet it's very commonplace for people to exaggerate any kind of climate challenge. For example, Al Gore in his movie, An Inconvenient Truth, portrays sea level rises as imminent, not just imminent, we're going to have 20-foot sea level rises within decades. And this is nowhere in any scientific literature. He just made it up based on what people projected 2,000 years from now, and he thought it would be fun to make it look like it would happen in 20 years, because that would be very motivating to people, I guess. But that's totally illegitimate. So we need to be precise. We cannot exaggerate, otherwise we'll make a bad decision. Just like if your doctor totally exaggerated the negative side effects of a life-saving drug, he could kill you, because he could deprive you of the benefits of a life-saving drug. So this is the first big point, and it's the most important point. If I could have you take only one point away from tonight, it would be this idea of we have to carefully weigh the benefits and side effects of fossil fuels when we're thinking about the issue, and we have to bring this up when we're talking about the issue. And if you can, I call it framing, if you can frame the conversation this way, it's very, very powerful, because it's common sense, nobody can disagree with it, yet it totally changes how they think about it. By contrast, if you're talking with people and you just spew or say 10 facts at them, it doesn't work very well, because if their thinking method is to only look at negatives and not positives, then they have a bias, and they're not going to even process any positives, and they're going to exaggerate any negatives. So I think the first thing is to get people to think clearly about it and get them to agree to think clearly about it, and then to look at the facts. And my view is, once you think clearly about fossil fuels, once you carefully weigh the benefits and side effects, it's actually pretty obvious that we need more fossil fuels, and that net zero is one of the worst ideas that human beings have ever come up with. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to follow these three principles, and then we'll take questions, and I'm just going to share with you what I think are the key facts. And when I share these facts, these are all going to be either primary sources, or in the case of climate science, where there are conclusions, it's going to be mainstream climate science. So I'm not going to draw it all on some really controversial conclusion or some made-up fact or questionable fact. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to put together the mainstream facts, but actually carefully weighing the benefits and the side effects. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's talk about the broad benefits of continuing fossil fuel use. And here there are going to be three key ideas of the broad benefits of continuing fossil fuel use. So one is going to be that fossil fuels are a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. I'll talk about that in a second. But one is they're going to be a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. Two is that the more cost-effective energy is, the better human life is. That's going to be two. And then three is that the world needs much more cost-effective energy. So fossil fuels are uniquely cost-effective. The more cost-effective energy is, the better human life is. And then the world needs much more cost-effective energy. And the conclusion is the world needs a lot more fossil fuels, and getting rid of them would be murderous, literally. Okay, so let's talk about this. And I want to address some of the myths that we get, because one of the myths we hear is, my first idea is fossil fuels are uniquely cost-effective, and what we hear is, no, that's not at all true. There aren't actually any real benefits of fossil fuels, because fossil fuel can be rapidly replaced by mostly solar and wind. And I'm going to argue, no, fossil fuels are and will remain for the foreseeable future uniquely cost-effective, and there are four elements of being cost-effective. So one is affordability. How much can a typical person afford to use? If it's not affordable, it doesn't really matter. Number two is reliability. So is it available when needed, in the quantity needed, in the exact quantity needed? This is particularly important for electricity. Here's a pop quiz. What percentage of the time do solar and wind give you exactly the amount of energy you need? Somebody said 2 and 3. No, it's essentially 0. It's never the exact amount. That doesn't mean you can't use them, but it does mean they have a lot of challenges that people have to factor in, and as we'll see, they generally don't. Okay, so it needs to be affordable, reliable, versatile. This is a really underrated one. Able to power every type of machine. Most people think that if you try to replace fossil fuels for electricity, that covers everything. But most of the world's energy use is not electricity. Most of it is directly burning fossil fuels, either for transportation or heat. And the reason is that's either the only cost-effective way to do it, or the only way to do it, period, like with a lot of aviation and cargo ships, or it's by far the cheapest way to do it, like with a lot of industrial heat, burning natural gas for heat, for example. So there's affordable, reliable, versatile, and then the final one is scalable. So is it affordable, reliable, and versatile for billions of people in thousands of places? If it's not scalable, then the benefits of it are very, very limited. Okay, so my argument is going to be fossil fuels are uniquely cost-effective, affordable, reliable, versatile, and scalable. Okay, so let's look at what are the myths that we hear? What are the challenges we hear? Well, one is fossil fuels are being rapidly replaced in an energy transition to solar and wind. And you might hear oil companies talking about energy transition, but this is really just a wish. This is not a reality, because how can you be in an energy transition when the fact is fossil fuel uses 80% of the world's energy and it's still growing? And this is despite 100+ years of aggressive competition and over 20 years of political hostility. Remember, getting rid of fossil fuels is the most popular political idea in the world, and fossil fuel use is still growing. So there's something special about fossil fuels, or at least seems like there is, but we get more denial of this. So the next thing you hear is, okay, even if we're using more fossil fuels, that's just very temporary. Fossil fuel use is going to really rapidly decline soon because everyone knows that green energy is cheaper. So we're just going to have to catch up. For some reason, we didn't realize this, but we're going to realize it soon. But the truth is the countries that care most about cheap energy are pro-fossil fuels. And one of the leading example here is China, the country that cares most about cheap energy. And they're the leading producer of solar and wind and battery technology, but how do they do it? They do it overwhelmingly using coal. And that's not just a transient thing. They have more coal in the process of being built in the pipeline than we have coal total in the US. So they have more new coal planned than we have total in the US. And this is all designed to last 40+ years. They're not doing it to shut it down in 4 years. That's not a good economic plan. So again, there's something special about fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are uniquely cost effective. Okay, the next way of trying to get around this is they'll say, no, actually, but look, solar and wind are growing fast. And this is true in a certain sense. Solar and wind, in terms of their relative size, are growing fast. So now they've gotten up to be about 5% of the world's energy. But it makes a big difference. Are they growing because they're really outcompeting something on a free market, or are they growing with a lot of help from government? And if you look at what the actual situation, solar and wind get huge preferences from the government, and fossil fuels get huge punishments from the government. So in particular, solar and wind get huge subsidies. So as in, we have to pay, the government makes us pay to keep these companies afloat. They get mandates, which means in many places we're forced to use certain amounts of solar and wind. And then the worst one that's least discussed is there's no penalty for unreliability, no price penalty for unreliability. So here's an analogy that a friend of mine came up with that I really like. Imagine the government passed a law about rental car markets, and it told the rental car companies, here's the deal now. There's no price penalty for unreliability. So you can rent a car that works all the time, or a car that works a third of the time and you don't know when, and you have to charge the same price for both. People would say that's insane, right? But this is how electricity markets work. You have some sources that work all the time, and you have some sources that work a third of the time and you don't know when, and they get the same compensation. Well, that's rewarding unreliability. That's a huge preference, and it has very bad consequences. At the same time, fossil fuels get punished. So we punish fossil fuel investment. We have all sorts of ESG stuff punishing fossil fuel investment. We punish fossil fuel production. Fracking gets banned all around the world. We ban, Biden has been trying to ban drilling on federal lands. We punish fossil fuel transportation. There's all sorts of pipeline blockages and shutdowns and prevention and that kind of thing. And then we punish fossil fuel use. We shut down reliable fossil fuel power plants. So they're not actually more cost effective, they're getting government preferences. Now, the next kind of myth that you'll hear is, well, no, but I have a study. I found a study that says solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuels. This is the way it usually goes. They'll say, I have a study that shows solar and wind are cheaper than fossil fuels. And there are two fallacies here. One is they try to do like an apples to oranges comparison, because all the studies on solar and wind are just studies on electricity. But most of the world's energy is not electricity. So if you say, hey, I have a study that shows solar and wind are cheaper for electricity, that doesn't mean anything for what it can do for a combine harvester or a cargo ship or an airplane. So it's just a total apples to oranges comparison. So one thing is, for the vast majority of things we do, or for a lot of things we do with fossil fuels, solar and wind just can't do them. But then the second thing that's very important is it's when they do the electricity, they're not comparing reliable electricity to reliable electricity. They're comparing reliable electricity to unreliable electricity. So when they do these studies, what they do, there's one called levelized cost of energy or levelized cost of electricity that you see quoted all the time. If you look out for this, LCOE. But LCOE officially, and you can see this on energytalkingpoints.com, they literally say we do not take into account reliability-related considerations. So they're comparing the cost of unreliable solar and wind to reliable fossil fuel. But nobody wants unreliable energy, so it's a useless comparison. What you need to compare is what's the cost of reliable fossil fuels compared to what's the cost of making unreliable solar and wind reliable. And for that, you have to factor in the huge backup cost. And here, the Texas situation in 2021 is a very good illustration. Because in the lead up to that Texas freeze, solar and wind seemed great. They were providing upwards of 50% of the electricity. So people would think, oh, wow, this is so great. All we need to do is double our solar and wind, and then we don't need those fossil fuels anymore, right? But then what happens is we have a winter storm, big surprise, and surprisingly, apparently to people, during a winter storm, you don't have a lot of sunlight. And then also the wind dies down often, which is the main thing that happened, not turbines freezing, that happened too, but the main thing is the wind dying down. And for a significant period of time, wind and solar were meeting less than 5% of demand. And in fact, at one point, they went to less than 1% of their theoretical capacity. So people often use the term, I'm very big on word choice and using words precisely. I never use the word capacity with solar and wind, because capacity means something you can do. It doesn't mean something you want to do or hope to do. So I call it fantasy when they talk about a capacity of 100 megawatts. So they were operating at less than 1% at one point of fantasy. So if something can go near zero at any given time, what percentage backup do you need for reliability? You need 100%. So if you need 100%, what that means is the cost of solar and wind is not just the cost of the solar panels and wind turbines and transmission lines, it's also the cost of the whole reliable infrastructure to give them 24/7 life support. And when you factor this in, it's incredibly expensive. This is why German energy is so expensive, German electricity in particular. And so what people do is they don't like paying for two grids. They don't like paying for the unreliable grid and the reliable grid. So what they do is they compromise on the reliable grid. And I call this reliability chicken. And I live in the champion state of this, which is California, but it's being practiced around the country. So reliability chicken means you to cut costs and to make yourself appear green, you shut down as many reliable power plants as you think you can get away with, and then you hope the sun shines enough, the wind blows enough, it doesn't get too hot, and it doesn't get too cold. Right? That's our policy right now. That's why we have emergencies and outages all over the place. And this is not a good policy, and it's certainly not solar and wind being cheaper than fossil fuels. So there's many more of these myths. Highly recommend sign up for our list, energytalkingpoints.com, or email me, alex@alexepstein.com. But I'll just give one more, which is batteries. And this is, I have very mixed feelings and mixed history with this guy, Elon Musk, who's I like in a lot of ways, but he blocked me a long time ago, and then he unblocked me, but he blocked me for calling the Tesla a really good fossil fuel car, which I thought was a nice compliment, actually, but he didn't think so. Anyway, then he unblocked me for interesting reasons. But he he's always claiming, well, we can just power the world with solar and wind. And with solar, he's focused on solar, maybe because he sells solar. And he says we could power the whole world with solar and then my megapacks, his batteries. So I went on the website and I calculated, well, how much would it cost to just back up the world's energy supply for one day? Because I'm going to be using just solar. I want way more than a day of backup because, sun can fade and be less than you want for a long time. And the calculation is 1 day of world energy is $190 trillion in Tesla megapacks. Okay, that's double global GDP. So, and that's for batteries that last 10 years. So this is not, solar, wind, and batteries is nowhere near a viable source of reliable electricity, which is why the only way solar and wind are used around the world is by being a parasite on fossil fuels, or let's be nicer, let's call it a dependent on fossil fuels and nuclear. So they're certainly not cheaper if they're a dependent. Okay, so the bottom line is, so there's a lot more to say about this stuff, but the bottom line is that fossil fuels are and will remain uniquely cost effective, so affordable, reliable, versatile, on a scale of billions of people in thousands of places, which means that if we have energy freedom policies, we can have global cost effective energy. We can have energy like where we have enough and it's cheap enough where almost all the world, hopefully all the world soon, can afford it. If we go net zero, so if we rapidly eliminate fossil fuels, we're going to have very little energy around the world. There's no getting around it if fossil fuels are actually uniquely cost effective. So that's the one I want into the most depth on in terms of the myths, because there are so many lies about this issue, and it's very annoying, but it's important to know them. And I even only went through half of them. But the reality is fossil fuels are and will remain a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. So that's the big first point, and that's the one that I needed the most factual detail on. The others are simpler to prove. So that's number one. That's the first aspect of the broad benefits of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. Now the next thing is, well, how important is that? And maybe this audience doesn't need to know that, but in general, the world needs to know that. Because the world today does not place much value on cost-effective energy. The whole value the world places on, quote, saving the planet or saving the climate. And this is a very revealing quote from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez from New York, also known as AOC. And she says this. So she's explaining why she was mad that people were saying the Green New Deal would be expensive. And she couldn't understand why people cared about that. She said, the world is going to end in 12 years if we don't address climate change, and your biggest issue is how are we going to pay for it? So the idea is, who cares about the cost of energy, the cost effectiveness of energy, when the planet is at stake? It just doesn't matter that much. Why are we so hung up on this? And this is exactly wrong. The thing that matters most to how livable the planet is, so how good human life is on this planet, is how cost-effective energy is. So this is the second point. The more cost-effective energy is, the better human life is on this planet. I want to show you a chart, which is one of my two favorite charts in energy. And it's an interesting chart, because what it shows is there's a very strong correlation, and I'll talk about that term in a second, correlation among these four things. CO2 emissions, and then the key measures of how good human life is on this planet. So we see that for centuries and centuries and centuries, CO2 emissions are flat. And then suddenly, about 200 years ago, they go up like a hockey stick. Now, according to the received wisdom, where CO2 is the most evil force on Earth, you would have, of course, expect everything to start getting worse. But the opposite happened. So at the same time, life expectancy was flat, around 30, and then it started skyrocketing, where it's going above 70 around the world. These are global statistics. Then GDP per capita, so it's well under $500 adjusted for inflation, and then suddenly we all become rich. And then the last one makes the most sense. If we're living longer and becoming rich, we're going to have more of a population because not as many people are dying so early. But let's focus on this up on the left here. So the CO2 emissions. So obviously it's not just the CO2 that's causing the benefit if there is in fact a cause. But it also should show CO2 might not be the most evil thing if it perfectly correlates with a good Earth for people. But the main thing is the energy. CO2 is an indicator of fossil fuel use, and fossil fuel use is most of our energy. It's really about using cost-effective energy. Now, some people will say, well, look, that's just a correlation, right? It's like ice cream sales and shark attacks. I don't know if you've heard that one before, right? So you can show a chart that shows that ice cream sales and shark attacks kind of go together, and they correlate. And why is that? Because it's summer, right? So there's an underlying cause. It's a derivative thing. So people argue this, yeah, it's not really energy. It's just it happened to happen at the same time, and it's actually, medical care, sanitation, scientific progress, and technological progress. Now, there are actually 3 reasons why this is wrong, why fossil fuels are actually fundamental. So all these things are incredibly important. How could you deny that? But fossil fuels are more important because they're fundamental to these 4. So there are 3 key reasons for this that I've thought of. So anyone want to take a shot?
Electricity 24/7.
How does that relate to these?
Without good lighting, how do you get good medical care?
Yeah.
How do you get proper sanitation without good lighting?
Yeah, so that's a great aspect of one of the key ones, which is just all of these machines, all of these fields rather, depend on the use of machines. And the use of machines requires energy. Energy is just, I call it machine food or machine calories. Okay, that's one. All of these fields use machines. What else? Yes?
I'm a farmer, I can do really the work that 100 people used to do. And so we're producing a lot more food.
Right, so that's another great example of using machines. So one is fossil fuels power the machines in all of these other fields. But also, well, actually, I'm not sure which one you meant, because there's another one that you brought up too, which is you said you can do the work that 100 people used to be able to do, right? So that's my favorite one because that's time. Because fossil fuels, by having us use machines to be inordinately productive, we free up time to do other things. And think about how much time we have to do medical care, how much time we have to do sanitation, engage in scientific progress, engage in technological progress. That's because 90+% of us are no longer on the farm. And so this is a key aspect of cost-effective energy. It frees up time for other productive activities and time for innovation. So we've got 2 of them. Okay, there's a third one that it's not cost-effective energy, but it relates to fossil fuels, a way in which fossil fuels benefits all of these things, and these things could not be what they are without fossil fuels. So medical care couldn't be the same, sanitation couldn't be the same. Anyone want to take a shot? You got it. Plastics, so more broadly synthetic materials. Fossil fuels are not only an amazing source of energy because of their chemistry, they're an amazing source of synthetic materials. So you could just point to, and this was the first thing that fascinated me about fossil fuels, you can just point to 100 things in this room that are made from oil and natural gas. So like the coating on this, the coating on the floor, the insulation, the paint, the keys on my computer, many components of your iPhone, this plastic bottle, this carpet, et cetera, et cetera. So much of the world is made from these things, and medical care could not be what it is without these petroleum products. Sanitation absolutely couldn't. Scientific progress uses all this stuff. Technological progress uses it. So I stress this because cost-effective energy is just about the most important thing. And here's the key idea. The more cost-effective energy is, the more we can use machines to improve our lives. That's the key thing. Because energy is machine food, so the more cost-effective energy is, the more machines you can use, and that means the more you can use machines to improve your life. And there are 2 big ways in which we use machines. One is we amplify our natural abilities, the things we can do on our own. So farming is one example. We use a combine harvester, we become 100 or 1,000 times more productive. The other thing, though, is it expands our abilities. So there are many things we can do with machines that we can't do by ourselves no matter what. So for example, flying a plane, right? We can't get 100 of us together and then fly. That doesn't work. So we can only do that with energy and machines. One that should really be powerful to us, because it's just a chronic problem in the world, is you cannot incubate babies without machines and without energy. So I tell a story in my book, Fossil Future, also my previous one, The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels, about a woman in the Gambia in Africa, but this happens all the time, she's a premature baby. If it had been born in the United States, it would have been totally fine. The baby would have grown up healthy, all that good stuff. But they didn't have an incubator. Why didn't they have an incubator? Because they didn't have reliable electricity. And so the babies just tragically die, and the opportunity for life is just lost. And this is because they lack energy. So this is so important. Fossil fuels are a uniquely cost-effective source of energy, and the more cost-effective energy is, the better human life is. So if we get that, energy is so, so, so important. And then the final thing is we need a lot more of it in the world. That's what that Gambia example points to. Now, people try to get away with pretending this isn't the case. They say, well, we don't really need more energy. In fact, we use too much energy. We should use less energy, and let's just be efficient. A guy I was trying to debate, but he never showed up to the debate a few months ago, like he just said, well, let's just be energy efficient. Just go on Zoom calls instead of flying around, and then we'll save all this energy. And first of all, I prefer to fly a lot of times than use Zoom calls, but the main thing is the world needs so much more energy, you cannot solve that by efficiency. You need to solve it mostly by more energy. So for example, 1/3 of the world, this chart shows, is using wood and animal dung for heating and cooking. And they're using that because that's the cheapest source of energy available to them, is just using what's in their local environment. They're using very little energy, very low quality energy with a lot of pollution problems. We have 3 billion people using less electricity than a typical US refrigerator. So think about your refrigerator, and that's all the electricity you get. Like, that's the state of 3 billion people. 6 billion people use an amount of energy that we would consider unacceptable, around 1/3 what we use or less. So the world is so starved of energy. So let's summarize this. Fossil fuels are a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. We're looking at the broad benefits of fossil fuels going forward. They're a uniquely cost-effective source of energy. The more cost-effective energy is, the better human life is, and the world desperately needs more cost-effective energy. What that means is that fossil fuels are an irreplaceable for the near-term source of the cost-effective energy we need to flourish, which by that I mean live long, healthy, opportunity-filled lives. So this is just, I don't think anyone can deny this if you really look at the benefits of fossil fuels and you look at the facts. So what this means is if we have energy freedom, we can use fossil fuels and other forms of energy, and billions more people have the opportunity to flourish. If we go net zero, billions of energy-starved people will plunge into poverty and early death. I don't think you can even calculate how destructive net zero would be. I am very confident, and I mean this literally, it would be the most destructive thing that ever happened in human history. And I'm well aware of many bad things that have happened in human history. But I just don't see any way around that. If you take a world of 8 billion people who depend on cheap energy, including to eat, and you take away their leading source of energy and you eliminate it when there's no alternative. Okay, so we see these enormous benefits of fossil fuels going forward. Now let's look at this issue of climate mastery, because the main argument is, well, we can't have these benefits because of climate. But because we're so afraid of storms and floods and extreme temperatures, they're just going to ruin our lives. But if you're thinking about those problems, you also have to think about how do fossil fuels help us deal with those? Because if fossil fuels give us an ability to deal with all those things really well, then there's no problem, right? So let's look at how good are fossil fuels at helping us deal with climate. Now, the myth we hear is that not very much. Like, we're using fossil fuels, we're trying to adapt, but climate change is just too much. And so that means it's just going to get worse and worse and worse. That's, if you look at what the UN says, what they're saying at this COP28, the whole thing is doomsday. It's just life is terrible and it's getting worse. And this just totally contradicts the facts, because they claim that we're more endangered than ever by climate because of fossil fuel CO2 emissions. But the reality is, and this is my second favorite chart in energy, you can see CO2 is going up as we use fossil fuels, but the death rate from climate disasters is going way down. So storm deaths, flood deaths, extreme temperature deaths, et cetera. Now, why is this? It has a lot to do with fossil fuels, because fossil fuels power machines that allow us to do things like heating and cooling, infrastructure building, storm warning systems, evacuation systems, irrigation, crop transport. And so what that's done is that's taken the naturally dangerous climate and made it incredibly safe. So one of my favorite expressions is fossil fuels didn't take a safe climate and make it dangerous. They took a dangerous climate and made it safe. And what this means is fossil fuels are so good at protecting us from climate. They're protecting us from the natural climate, but they're also protecting us from anything we've changed in the last 150 years. So if they're so good at protecting us from climate, what that means is that it's really hard to imagine anything that would be a problem. Like, what's going to happen? It would have to be a huge negative climate change. The only other argument somebody can make is, well, it's going to cost us so much money, right? Even if we're not all dying, we're just going to lose all this money. But if you actually look at the data of what percentage of our wealth are we losing from climate disasters, it's actually, and this is the best way of measuring it, losses as a percentage all of this catastrophism we hear, and interestingly, despite the fact that there are many incentives to increase damages. One is the government bails people out for weather damages all the time, so that encourages people to take more weather risks than they otherwise would. Another is that as we become wealthier, we can choose to live in more vulnerable areas because we can afford it. But even despite that, these damages are flat. So what this shows is that if we continue using fossil fuel energy, which is uniquely cost effective, we'll have these incredible climate mastery abilities, which means that if we have energy freedom, we're going to keep getting better at mastering climate to the point where it's so hard to think of anything that could be a problem because we're so good at it. Whereas if we go net zero, we're going to have very little energy, and so we'll be terrible at dealing with climate, and then we're going to go back to having a lot more climate death. So that's the context we need to have. When people talk about climate change and climate science, you have to recognize the CO2 and other greenhouse gases they're concerned with, those come with huge benefits, including huge climate mastery or climate protecting benefits. So for it to be a problem is really hard because it would have to be just a total different change than we've experienced from emitting CO2 so far. So now let's look at that. Is there really such a big problem? Is there anything that resembles a catastrophe? And to do this, remember, we need to factor in the positive and negative climate impacts, and we need to do it with precision. And once you do this, you can see that it doesn't make any sense to think of this as a catastrophe or apocalypse. So let's start out with the different arguments. One is just the planet getting any warmer is going to be a problem. Like it's just going to be such a problem, and the idea is heat-related death is such a problem, and so any warming is going to just be a disaster. Now, this probably isn't that resonant to you guys given where you live, but a lot of other people think it is. But the fact is, so Earth has gotten 1 degree warmer, and I think at least in part due to fossil fuels in the last 100+ years, and yet far more people die from cold than from heat. And what this means is that near term, if we have more warming, if the warming is equally distributed, we're going to have more lives saved from cold death than caused by heat death. And this is even ignoring our ability to use air conditioning, in which case you'll become safer from both if you heat and air condition. But then people think, oh wait, isn't the warming going to hurt the people at the equator most? It's just going to make the hot places hotter. People just make up this stuff because it sounds bad. But this is Biden's climate.gov, so this is not some right-wing outlet. And what this shows is that warming has occurred and is expected to occur in colder places more, concentrated in colder places, colder times of day, so at night, and then colder seasons, particularly winter. And what that means is that actually warming will be even more beneficial than if it were equally distributed, and it makes it non-catastrophic. That's why people are so focused on the Arctic, by the way. We'll talk about sea levels, but it's because that's warming more, but that's a good thing. It's better if Siberia is warming more than the equator. Like that's actually a good thing, and the people in Siberia want that. Now the next thing people think is, okay, well, even if it's not a problem now and won't be a problem in a little bit, what's going to happen is the warming is going to go out of control. So it's going to be exponential, right? So it's just going to be, it starts here and it goes up, and then it's going to go crazy. But this totally contradicts the history of the planet and mainstream climate science. If you think of the history of the planet, we've had 10 times more CO2 in the history of the planet than we had today, and the planet didn't burn up. So obviously it can't be exponential, because if it's exponential, then life wouldn't be able to exist. It would just be a fireball. But in fact, what happens is, as CO2 increases, it loses power to warm. It has a diminishing effect. So as you put more CO2 in the atmosphere, you get diminishing returns. That's why every single climate model, even I think the crazy ones, show warming leveling off. Okay, so now we have is the idea that warming is going to be some catastrophe that justifies getting rid of energy makes no sense at all. I mean, it never really made any sense to say, I'm worried about it becoming hot, so let's not allow anyone to have air conditioning, right? Which is basically what the argument amounts to. But it doesn't make sense on any terms. So what they have to retreat to is say, okay, it's not the warming, but it's the climate changes that come from the warming. And the most plausible here are sea level rise and storms. Like it's at least plausible, well, sea level rise in particular, right? That if you have warming, you're going to have melting of ice. That only really matters actually if it's on a land mass, like at the South Pole. It doesn't matter if it's on water. But the water will expand, oceans will expand with heat. And so if it warms rapidly enough, or if sea level rises rapidly enough, it'll be significant. But let's look at even what the mainstream science says, which I think it has a lot of biases to exaggerate. But what it's showing is 3 feet in 100 years. It's not Al Gore's 20 feet in a few decades. So it's 3 feet in 100 years. That is not a catastrophic rate of sea level rise. It is much, much less than our ancestors, by the way, had to deal with. And we already have 100 million people who live below high tide sea level. So we're going to keep getting better and better at dealing with sea levels. And if this comes, which seems very doubtful, because right now we're at 1 foot a century, we'll be able to deal with it just fine, whereas we cannot deal with not having energy. Now, the other thing is storms. So are storms going to get so much more intense it'll just destroy all our infrastructure, something like that? Well, if you look at the actual science, the projections are with hurricanes, which are the main concern, they'll become less frequent, but they'll become more intense, but it's 1 to 10% more intense. So this is not some dramatic thing that we can't deal with. This is not at all catastrophic. So one of the key distinctions I want to make is there's a difference between climate impact and climate catastrophe, and never equate those. I don't even like the term climate change, but climate impact and climate catastrophe, don't ever let somebody equate those two things. It's perfectly possible to impact the climate in a way that's benign or beneficial or harmful, but it's not that big a deal. The idea of catastrophe requires it to be a dramatic negative impact that we have an inability to master. And there's not the evidence of either of a dramatic negative impact, and we certainly have the ability to master just about anything. So what this means is that continuing fossil fuel use will lead to more warming and other changes, but we can master them and we can flourish and life can keep getting better. Just like it's way better now, even though it's a little warmer than 50 years ago or 100 years ago, that can continue in the future. So with energy freedom, we'll have higher CO2 levels, life will continue to get better and better. If we have net zero, CO2 levels will rise more slowly, at least into 2050 they'll supposedly stop, which definitely won't happen because China definitely won't do it. But if it did happen, billions of lives would be ruined. I mean, good for China. They'll save the world if they don't go net zero and the rest of us do. But it's even stupider to go net zero because I mentioned China. The only way you actually get emissions reductions long term is if you have energy freedom policies. Why? Because the only way to get emissions reductions long term around the world is if the energy is genuinely cheaper, if it's non-carbon energy. If it's more expensive, only rich people will do it, and even they will lose patience with it. So you see what's happening now is China is building 300 new coal plants, or there are 300 new coal plants in process, because that's the actual cheapest thing. So if you want to change that, the key is make something genuinely cheaper. Don't punish America while China's building all these new coal plants. It doesn't make any sense. Don't punish Wyoming in particular. So this whole thing makes no sense at all. And if you look at the ways in which people have actually reduced emissions somewhat, their energy freedom, it's improving natural gas and improving nuclear, and both of those are mainly the product. So if we put this all together, number one, there's two kind of core ideas. One is we need to carefully weigh the benefits and side effects of fossil fuels, and remember that breaks down into the broad benefits, which we saw are absolutely enormous. It really makes the planet a place in which human life is good. And then the climate mastery benefits, which allow us to deal with almost any kind of climate danger. And then if we look at we're even-handed and precise about the side effects, we see that there's nothing very dramatic, and even if there was, we would be totally fine because we can master it. It's very clear that we should be using more fossil fuels going forward. And in particular, we should have a policy of energy freedom. The only reason, or the only way people can get away with thinking net zero by 2050 is a good idea, is that they fail to carefully weigh benefits and side effects. Instead, they fail to recognize the unique benefits of fossil fuels, and then they exaggerate, or sometimes I call catastrophize, the negative side effects. And therefore, it's a terrible, terrible movement. It's just as if you had a movement that was ignoring the benefits of antibiotics and tried to get rid of all antibiotics before you had a viable replacement. That would harm billions of people. This one is even worse. It's really, really bad where you have a movement, and it's a lot of smart people, unfortunately, and one of the things about smart people is it's actually like they do more damage if their thinking methods are bad. It's like it's not, right? It's just like a technology, right? If you have more power and it's put in the wrong way, it's bad. And unfortunately, a lot of the world's smartest people are thinking about this in a really irrational and destructive way. And we need to change that. And so the way to change that is to help people change their thinking methods and to give them this alternative of energy freedom. So that's been my goal today. I hope you found it useful. Please either go to energytalkingpoints.com and sign up, or send me an email at alex@alexepstein.com, because what that's going to give you is that's going to give you a huge abundance of totally free resources that you can use to educate yourself and educate others. I'm a big believer in the power of the internet if you use it intelligently. And what that means is two things. One is finding the best possible resources that are most persuasive. I've tried to create those. And two is sharing them with the best people. So anyone you think is open-minded, or anyone who's well-known that you think might be open to this, share these resources with them, and I think you'll see you can make a huge difference. So thank you very much, and I'd love some questions. And also, we have I Love Fossil Fuels pins up here. I'll put my info on the screen. Any questions? Oh, okay, you and then you, yes.
We know that at some point, fossil fuel resources are limited. They've been surprised by the amount we have found. The most recent estimate I've heard is that we've got another 500 years or so worth of them. What estimate do you believe in terms of that?
So I don't believe in any estimates. I think I believe in lower bound estimates, but I don't believe in upper bound estimates. But I'll give you some rough numbers that I think are helpful. So the issue is the principle. I think I'll give you the numbers in a second, but I think the principle is that in general resources are limitless, and the reason is because in terms of things that perform a certain function. So like energy resources are limitless. And the reason is that resources are just raw matter and energy. Oh, we having a problem? Oh, gotcha. Raw matter and energy made valuable by the human mind. So here's a question, and you're all going to get it wrong. I'm telling you right now. Are oil and coal valuable natural resources? Who says yes? Raise your hand. Who says no? Oh, this guy. Okay, why not?
I think that they are, but I know this is a trick question.
Oh,
I say that they're valuable because there's a finite amount. If there is no finite amount, then there's no value.
well, good for you for recognizing the trick question. But the reason they're not valuable natural resources is they're not naturally resources. Oil and coal were not naturally resources. Oil in particular, right? It was an impediment when people were trying to drill for salt. So it's only a resource because it's been transformed by the human mind to be a resource. So if you think of the world this way, you just realize everything is a potential resource. Like aluminum, incredibly abundant in the earth, used to be totally useless. Now it's a valuable resource, but it's not a natural resource, it's a created resource. So with oil, what happens over time, the reason why we've been, quote, surprised, is because people equate the amount that we know how to find right now with the amount that exists. Like it's called reserves with deposits is the technical term. I talk about this in chapter 5 of the book. Now, if you look at the raw potential with oil, coal, and gas, there's 10 plus times more of them in the ground somewhere, at least, than we've used in the entire history of civilization. So the whole question, so that's almost a limitless amount. The question is just kind of how can they be cost effective? Because it doesn't mean if they're available, they're cost effective. And the one we have the most confidence in the availability of and cost effectiveness of is actually coal. And the reason is because coal is really easy to get and for historical reasons exists pretty near the Earth's surface. Oil and natural gas can do things that coal can't, but they're a pain to get, like compared to coal. So one of the holy grails is if you figure out how to refine coal really cheaply so you can separate out the solid, separate out the liquid, separate out the gas. People claim to do that. I haven't seen anyone who's proven it on the market yet, but I hope they do. That would be one of the great achievements in human history, to do it cheaply. People have done it expensively. So with hydrocarbons, yeah, there's just sort of limitless potential. We have methane hydrates for natural gas at the bottom of the ocean. The thing we need to be worried about running out of is freedom. That is the thing we need to be worried about running out of. And when I say energy resources are unlimited, there's of course every other way to get energy that we know of and don't know of. So that's why it's only, you don't worry about running out of resources, worry about running out of freedom. I think you had a question? Yes.
It's less technical. And
Okay, that's okay.
you're speaking to an audience that. Chris, don't make me do this. You're speaking to an audience that agrees with you. I'm curious what happens when you talk to an audience that comes in ready to fight.
Well, so I'm mostly, on college campuses I mentioned, I'm mostly speaking to people who expect to disagree with me. It's not Casper College every night by any means. And most of what but interestingly, first of all, I don't think of it as people agree with me already, because I think that's not precise enough. Because if I thought everyone in here had exactly all the ideas in their head that I had in my head, I for sure would not come, right? I mean, I'm not trying to waste anyone's time, mine above all. So I think what you guys have is you have an understanding and in some ways a feeling that's basically right that most people don't have. So in a certain way, you're further along, and that's why I focus more on, hey, how do you persuade other people? But what I'm trying to give you is arguments and understanding that's effective for normal people. And really everything I write and say is designed to turn non-supporters of my views into supporters. So yeah, I've just gone to tons of campuses, and what'll happen sometimes is you'll get protesters, but usually that's helpful because then the rest of the audience sees that these protesters don't really have anything to say. I'm very nice to them. I'll sometimes let them start out, like if they want to, I was at Oklahoma State and there were 30 or 40 protesters, and I invited them to come in and I said, you know what, you guys can I'll give you the first word. You can give me all your objections to what I'm going to say, and I'll let you speak, and and they refused. But that made them look really bad, right? And so sometimes they'll take me up on it and I'll address it. So the key to addressing audiences, there's some people who are very unreasonable. Usually if their job is tied to it or their self-esteem is tied to hating fossil fuels, that can be hard, but that's not most people. So most people are open, but you need to find a way to connect with them. And I think the key thing is to have a common understanding of how to think about the issue. And that's why I focus so much on, hey, let's look at this in an even-handed way. Don't you agree we should think about it this way? And what that does is that it makes them open to benefits they would never consider, and it makes them much calmer about climate stuff. Because most people are panicked about climate. And what happens is if they're panicked and you say, oh, that's all BS, right? It doesn't change their panic at all. They just think, oh, you're a climate change denier, I can't talk to you, you don't get it, et cetera. But if you say, okay, let's look at this, for sure, let's look at how fossil fuels impact climate, but let's do it in an even-handed and precise way, and let's also look at the benefits, including the benefits that help us deal with any climate problems, you're gonna win over a lot more people, and then they'll be open to the fact. So, yeah, everything I do is for people who disagree. I'm not at all in the business of like having a congregation of people that like me, or people that already agreed with me. I don't think I should be choosing the questioner, so I'll leave it to you.
I'm curious if I can cheat and do two questions. First,
Okay.
Of all the current candidates on both sides of the aisle for presidential candidates, who do you find to be the most educated and well-read, and who do you find makes you the most nervous? And if I can cheat and ask the second question, your personal thoughts on nuclear energy and its viability going forward.
Oh, well, the second one I'm going to be much more forthcoming about. So let's do that one first. So, what's that? Yeah, okay, thank you. And I have a big discussion of nuclear and fossil futures, and nuclear is an issue I'm very passionate about. I think it's one of the great tragedies in U.S. industrial and, for that matter, environmental history. It's the thing you would expect to surpass fossil fuels at some point, because one of the things about fossil fuels is they have these very special characteristics where they're naturally stored energy, so they're like a natural battery. They're very concentrated and they're very abundant, and nuclear has all of that, but way more concentrated. So in general, human beings go from less dense, non-stored sources of energy, like the sun and the wind, to more dense and stored sources of energy. And I think the 60s and 70s showed enormous potential with nuclear, and then the green movement ruined it by effectively criminalizing it. So I do a lot of political work. I'll talk about candidates in a second. But I advise a lot of politicians, which is part of why I'm not going to be very definite about my answer to your question, because it's not going to help me. But one of the big things I'm working on 5 big issues, and one of them is nuclear decriminalization. So coming up with nuclear policies that will allow nuclear to reach its full potential, not subsidies, but actually like having a real market in it. In terms of the candidates, so my own position is I got into politics about 3.5 years ago. I'm not running for anything, and I don't do any lobbying or any endorsements or anything. But the goal of Energy Talking Points, which I've talked about, was in part to give the best talking points that are backed up by facts and that are really effective to the general public, but also to give it to politicians. And with politicians, in addition to giving them all the public stuff, I advise them behind the scenes. And I have a whole team of people, and we advise at this point in various ways 200 plus major offices, so US House, US Senate, and governors. And then we also try to help at the state level, state people where we can. So if you're at the state level, make sure to give me your card, and I'll at least plug you into all of our resources. So you can imagine that it is not in my interest to single out a presidential candidate of a race that has not been determined. But I would say that I've connected with the campaigns of all the major candidates in one way or another. Some of them I know better. I would say, what I can say is, I think in general I can say that Joe Biden I have not communicated with. And unfortunately, I'm totally open to it. I'll talk to anyone from any party. Gavin Newsom, I would even talk to him. He has not taken advantage of me as a resource. The others have. I will say, I just said this on TV today, I thought DeSantis did a very good job on the energy issues in the debate last night, and in particular, he used a lot of the terminology and talking points that I like, so I have to say I was happy with that. He talked about how, and I thought this is a great point, and I haven't heard many people besides me make it, that the key policy distinction is between government-dictated green energy and energy freedom. And he didn't say energy freedom, he said freedom, and he talked about Newsom having government-dictated green energy, and then he really raked him over the coals for all these things like mandating electric cars and then not having enough electricity to charge our EVs, which was a real thing that happened, or just making our electricity unreliable, or making gasoline really expensive and then blaming big oil as if big oil is somehow singling out California. So in general, I think the messaging and policy ideas have improved, and I'm happy to be a part of that. But yeah, I'll advise anyone who asks. And hopefully the next president will be very engaged. Okay.
Your thoughts on investing in carbon capture? Is it money well spent?
All right, somebody had to ask this. So let's take this on a couple of levels. So my view, so I do not favor any government penalization of CO2 for the reasons that I gave. I mean, basically, I think that the world needs more fossil fuels, and there's not a cost-effective way to capture the CO2. So basically, we need to emit a bunch more CO2, and that'll have some positive consequences, some negative consequences, but the energy that generates the CO2 gives us plenty of ability to deal with the negative. My view is I just don't think there's an issue that justifies making energy more expensive, because anything you do to reduce CO2 that's not profitable, I'll get to that in a second. If it's profitable, that's a different thing. If you can capture it profitably, no subsidies, no mandates, then that's great. Then you're not compromising energy. But anything you do to reduce CO2 in a non-market way, in a non-free market way, is making energy more expensive. That's just by definition, right? If it were cheaper, then people would just do it profitably. So in general, my policy of energy freedom does not include any penalization of CO2. Now, if the facts were different, like in a different world, if I thought climate problems were different, then I'd be open to it, but I just don't see it. So that's my position in terms of what the policy should be. Now, insofar as the policy is, people are trying to limit CO2 in some way, then absolutely they should not discriminate against carbon capture. That makes no sense at all. Like if you're trying to reduce CO2, you absolutely need to incorporate carbon capture. I mean, just if that's your goal, it's insane to leave out something that achieves your goals. That on that level, the people who favor solar and wind subsidies and do not favor carbon capture, that's ridiculous. That doesn't make any sense on their terms. Okay, the third level is, what do you do when there's a bunch of subsidies, thanks to Joe Manchin, with the Inflation Reduction Act, and there are very large subsidies for carbon capture? Do you take advantage of it? And that, I think, is a harder question for me to answer, and not really my expertise. My expertise is on what the policy should be. It's not on when the policy is a given way, do you take advantage of it? Because there are real issues of not taking advantage of it. I would say, though, that if you do take advantage of it, you should absolutely be oriented toward a way of using the technology that will ultimately be profitable on the free market. So if you say, if your argument is, well, we just need a little money for carbon capture now, but it's ultimately going to be efficient to the point where the CO2 is valuable, like we turn the waste of it's in effect waste stream, we turn that into wealth, and we can actually use it for enhanced oil recovery or for some plant growth or whatever, and we can do that on a large scale. That's the most plausible way to me. If you say we're going to do this thing and it's going to be subsidized forever, I wouldn't count on anything being subsidized. So that's in terms of just how I think one should be as a politician. It is important to be realistic about the extent to which reducing CO2 is subsidized, including carbon capture. I mean, we pay a fortune for all of this stuff. Carbon capture is on a small scale, but just to give you rough numbers right now, let's say a ton of coal costs $30 or so, right? Ton of coal emits, depending on the type of coal, like 1.7 tons of CO2, because you actually get more mass in terms of CO2. Inflation Reduction Act pays $85 a ton of CO2. So if you do the math, $30 worth of coal gets a $150 subsidy to capture the CO2. That's a lot of money, right? That's 6 times the cost of the coal. Is China going to do that? Is India going to do that? So this is a really expensive thing. So so the final thing to say is it is not scalable globally with anything resembling the current subsidy and technology. And so then there's a question of, well, what are we really doing? Like, we're going to pay money, like why do we have a policy that's saying let's do these really expensive things in the US that the rest of the world won't do? This applies not just to carbon capture in its current form, but also other things. Like, we're going to do these and we're going to make energy more expensive so that China can just have even more coal plants because we get less competitive. So those are my answers to like the 5 different aspects of the question. Yes?
Following up on that last one, this county, we're using CO2 as tertiary recovery to produce oil on quite a scale out here at the Salt Creek field. We have, looks like, more need for CO2 than we can get out of our natural sources from producing natural gas, because there are some limited places in the state where you can get it that way, and that's what we're doing. It looks like if we could get it on the power plants, we could make quite a bit more money out of producing oil. And the question is, are we justified in taking the federal subsidies, because they do have some subsidy for CO2 used for enhanced oil recovery?
Right, and I think that was like the 3rd or 4th level, and it's just, I don't feel like there's even, it's hard for me to say what I would do in that position. All I would say is, if I were doing anything in that position, I'd be very open about what's going on, and I would definitely have a view toward how is this going to be sustained without that subsidy, because there are going to be people fighting against that subsidy, including me.
So, I don't know if you've encountered this yet, but I've run into people who seem to be of the opinion that we do need to be on an energy diet, and energy should be more expensive, and in particular, it should be more expensive for the wealthy.
Yeah.
And aside from the fact that I can't understand why anyone would voluntarily want to punish their own friends and neighbors, how do you respond to that?
A variation of this came up yesterday. I love this issue. I think you have to be clear on, is the argument that you're reducing energy use to reduce a harm, or are you reducing energy use because you think there's something inherently good about reducing energy use? In terms of reducing a harm, I've sort of addressed why I don't think you're harming people by using energy. I would also add that in general, using a lot of energy is one of the most helpful things you can do for other people. And the reason is because of the issue of freeing up time. I mentioned one of the key benefits is freeing up time. So the more energy we use, that means the more we're getting machines to produce value for us. That means the more time is freed up for us to come up with innovations. And probably a lot of us in this room have known somebody or had a friend who's known somebody who died of something that was curable 10 years later or 20 years later. And I think about this a lot when I think about what it means to slow progress. And I think about those people who slowed progress, and this loved one could have lived longer if it had not been for that person that I really resent, this movement that I really resent. So, but the opposite is true. Like, I want people to just have tons of time to think of great ideas, including things that will save my life and my loved one's life. So there's this general thing, there's a term you might hear called negative externalities. It's this economic term, but part of it is they don't talk about positive externalities. And using energy has enormous positive externalities, and the biggest one is the time it frees up for innovation. So that's kind of my answer to the first thing is, A, they're exaggerating the harms dramatically, they're ignoring our ability to overcome at least the climate challenges, and they're ignoring the huge benefits of using more energy. Now, in terms of, is it a virtue in and of itself? Like, let's say the energy is perfectly clean, right? There's no harms and clean and safe. And my answer is no. It is a vice to use less energy than is valuable for your goals. Now, look, if you just want to take a nap somewhere, there's no need to just have a lawnmower running for no reason, right? You don't have a fetish for using energy that you don't need, but in general, there are always things we can do with more energy. And we should embrace those things, and I agree with your basic perspective, which is, why would you limit energy use? And look, I'm a reasonably affluent guy. When I started this stuff, I was very broke, so compared to what I used to be, I'm affluent. But there's a lot of cool things people with a lot more money than I do can do, and those are great. And I think, look, it'd be great if we could all fly private jets. That's a really cool thing from what I've observed. Yes.
Full disclosure, I work in oil and gas in a supportive assistant anyway, but one of the discussions we've had is the theory of back in my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, my parents had the 30-year-old refrigerator that kept going and going and going. And now I have an energy efficient one, and I've replaced it 10 times in 20 years, 4 times in 20 years. And so where do we get the hypocrisy that energy efficient electric car, but the battery's $10,000 and it only lasts about 3 years? The replacement cost versus the energy saving that we're doing, and how do we combat the hypocrisy in the like in oil and gas when we have a minor spill and we injure 15 birds, but a wind turbine can kill an eagle and get nothing. For penalties. And so what's your advice on the hypocrisy of the green movement, I guess?
Well, I think they're sort of related and sort of not. I mean, I think with the wind turbine thing, you can make it as part of this point of being even-handed or carefully weighing benefits and side effects, and notice, like, hey, wait a second, why is it that when, even with the BP oil spill, like, everyone is obsessed with birds, but suddenly with wind turbines, they don't care about the birds, even though often the birds are birds that we much more value. Like, you can point that out, and but the way to make use of it is wake people up to the idea they're not thinking about it in an even-handed way, and then they can be open to other things. What was the energy efficiency thing is, I mean, that movement really needs to be demonized, and I've done it a little bit, but somebody really needs to make a life out of it, because it's such a corrupt thing. I mean, it's basically forcing us to use inferior things. That's what it is. And it's this totally paternalistic, condescending thing that we don't know how to choose a refrigerator. Like, if it's actually efficient, so here's the thing. Being energy efficient is not a virtue in and of itself. You want to be economically efficient, right? So if something uses less energy, but per unit of output, but the materials cost a lot more, or the reliability is terrible, what are you doing? It doesn't make any sense. So obviously the solution is just let us use whatever damn refrigerator we choose. That extends to toilets, which have been ruined. I mean, it's really, they're just making our lives filthy and inconvenient. And it's really embarrassing. I mean, the straws, we can't even have a real straw anymore. Like, I have an idea of like I made up a talk title, which I've never given, but it's called Guilt-Free Garbage. And I think that would be that's a great topic. Like, but it's just, the one thing to note, one thing we can't do is submit to these regressions in life. And maybe the one that's most offensive that people are submitting to is the decline in the grid. Just the idea that, and I'm not exactly sure what it is in Wyoming, but in other places, just you're getting, Texas this summer, for example, just day after day, people are getting things like, the power company is telling them don't use power. That's the main message from the power company. It's like a food company saying don't eat food. But it's because they've descended to this point where they're not allowing themselves to do what they need to have reliable electricity, namely use sufficient fossil fuels. But the sad thing is to see Texans taking it. Like, you need the pride to say, this is embarrassing. This is the year 2023 going on 2024. Like, Thomas Edison would be so embarrassed if he saw the current state of our grid. If he thought, I developed this technology and these guys can't even keep the lights on consistently. Like, it's so easy. We know how to do it. We're just preventing ourselves from doing it with bad ideas. But part of that is we need to have the self-esteem to say, yeah, I have the right to a good refrigerator, I have the right to a good toilet, I have the right to a good grid. And have that guilt-free attitude. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, at the back. And again, I'll be around to sign books. Go ahead.
Touched on the fact some of this is by design. Some of it is by intent, subversive in the direction of the United States.
Well, yeah, I would say
It isn't just stupidity.
no, that's true. So I don't mean to imply it's stupidity, but I can see where you got that from. So in the book in particular, I'll talk about it a little bit now, but chapter 3 is really about motives. So there is a class of motives where, there's some obvious motives where people who are against the United States love the idea of us disempowering ourselves. So there's that's a real thing, and there's actions, at least from Russia, that are documented that are trying to make us have bad policies. I think the bigger problem, though, is the leadership, a lot of the environmental leadership today has a deep hostility toward human life. And so the reason they're ignoring the benefits of fossil fuels to human life is their primary concern isn't human life. And in fact, their primary concern is reducing or eliminating human impact on the planet. And they say that openly, like that's what being green means, reducing or eliminating your impact on the planet. But think about how self-destructive that is. Like, can you imagine a lion that tried to reduce its impact on the planet? Or a beaver? Like, all the other animals rightly say, I'm going to impact the planet as much as I need to survive and flourish. That's what human beings, that's the attitude we need to have. We need to be willing to impact the planet in our interests. You don't want to impact it in a way that's unhealthy, but you want to impact in a way that benefits you. But we have a whole movement that says impact is bad. And that tries to pose as, we just want to reduce bad impacts, but it's really against all impact. And the leaders know what they're doing. They want a world that has less and less human life because they think there's something evil about human life. And I talk about that in chapter 3. But that, I think, is the animating force behind the leadership. They're not ignorant about the benefits of fossil fuels to human life, but they're not measuring fossil fuels by human life. They're measuring fossil fuels by the ideal of an unimpacted Earth. So I think that's the root motive. All right, so that's okay, let's just, on a positive topic, hopefully you got some good ideas today, carefully weighing benefits and side effects. Make sure to either send me an email or go to energytalkingpoints.com. Come get an I Love Fossil Fuels pin and come meet me and get a signed book. So thanks for having me, it was a lot of fun.